onward marked the onset of the most warped and tragic phase in 20th century Western music, the total politicizing of the art by totalitarian means. Dictators manipulated popular resentment and media spectacle to take control of half the European continent. In the Soviet Union, Stalin refined Lenin's revolutionary dictatorship into an omnipotent machine, buttressed by a cult of personality and rigid control of the media. In Germany, Hitler forged the most unholy alliance of art and politics the world had ever seen. Even in the United States of America, during the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we see an unprecedented consolidation of power in the office of the president and an equally unprecedented attempt to create a federal arts program, which was not above encouraging the creation of propaganda. Since the late 19th century, the institutions of classical music had increasingly prized the notion that they inhabited a separate, pure realm. On the title page of his opera Palestrina, the German composer Hans Pfitzner placed a quotation from Schopenhauer to the effect that, beside the history of the world, the history of philosophy, science, and art is guiltless and unstained by blood. That inscription acquired an ironic odor as Central European music was absorbed into the fascist state. Pfitzner, in fact, used this very page to write a dedication to Benito Mussolini. For anyone who cherishes the notion that there is some inherent spiritual goodness in artists of great talent, the era of the 30s and 40s is disillusioning. Not only did composers fail to rise up en masse against totalitarianism, many actively welcomed it. Thomas Mann was acutely mindful of their fate when, in his great wartime novel, Dr. Faustus, he told the story of a composer in league with the devil. This vast subject occupies the three central chapters of my book, The Rest is Noise. Here I'd like to offer a few meditations on the ideological manipulation of music in Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, with an addendum concerning the scrutiny of left-leaning artists in New Deal and Cold War America. Needless to say, we are still living in the aftermath of this frightening period in musical history and the resurgence of totalitarian, authoritarian, and otherwise anti-democratic politics around the world, including, I'm afraid to say, my own country, has made the question of the role of artists in an unfree state as pressing as ever. For many years, Stalin was depicted as a sort of cultural oaf, a supreme vulgarian who wrecked Russian culture with a few heavy blows. Latter-day biographers have been inclined to emphasize instead the cleverness of the man. He was able to manipulate many leading artists and intellectuals, not only because he wielded instruments of terror, but because he was able to pass himself off as a reasonably cultured man. Although he had nothing but contempt for radical aesthetics, he cherished the idea of a Soviet modernism that would embody the power and prowess of the proletarian state. He wanted artists to adhere to tradition, but to use tradition boldly. He was not as certain of his opinions in music as in literature, but he was a regular attendee at the Bolshoi Opera and Ballet. He liked to maintain his privacy as he listened, recreating the conditions of the solitary phonograph listener. He would take a seat in the back row of Box A at the Bolshoi just before the curtain rose, positioning himself behind a small curtain which concealed him from the audience without obstructing his view. His most famous intervention in musical life took place in January 1936, when he attended Dmitri Shostakovich's opera, Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, at the Bolshoi, a work that had been enjoying great success, seeming to embody that ideal of Soviet modernism. 9 days before, Stalin had gone to see Ivan Dzerzhinsky's opera, And Quiet Flows the Dawn, and afterward, the composer had been called to Box A to receive congratulations. Shostakovich, having been summoned to the house that night, was hoping for similar treatment. He placed himself in a seat where he could see the goings-on in Box A. But Stalin, ominously, walked out before the end with his entourage, which contained many leading members of the Politburo. Shostakovich was immediately filled with dread. This was fulfilled 2 days later when Pravda published an editorial with the headline, "Muddle Instead of Music," which condemned Lady Macbeth as artistically obscure and morally obscene. From the first moment of the opera, the anonymous author wrote, the listener is flabbergasted by the deliberately dissonant, muddled stream of sounds. Shostakovich was said to be playing a game that may end badly. This denunciation unquestionably reflected Stalin's personal aversion to the opera, but it did not stem from his distaste alone. Recent scholarship suggests that the Central Committee had already selected Lady Macbeth as an appropriate jumping-off point for a general campaign against wayward tendencies in the arts. The objective was not simply to strike terror into a particular artist and impose control upon him, though in this it certainly succeeded. It was also to create a situation in which subversive intellectuals could be caught speaking out against the state. In these same months, the newspapers were full of talk of Stalin's new constitution, with its promise of unprecedented liberties. After the Pravda editorial, artists were told that they could speak freely on the subject of formalism, as Western modernist tendencies were known, and about other internal matters. Informers from the NKVD, the secret police, could then monitor the results. And you can read samples of their reports in my book from Isaac Babel, Abram Lezhnev, and Vsevolod Meyerhold. I'll read Lezhnev's remarks. The horrible thing about any dictatorship is that the dictator does whatever his left leg tells him to do. We are like Don Quixote, always dreaming until reality tells us otherwise. I view the incident with S. Shostakovich as the advent of the same order that burns books in Germany. By 1941, at the latest, these three people, Babel, Lezhnev, and Meyerhold, had been killed by Stalin's regime. A footnote in the NKVD reports tells us that someone circled Lezhnev's name and put 2 check marks next to it. He was shot 2 years later. Shostakovich survived and even prospered. When the Pravda editorial was published, he was working on his 4th symphony, more dissonant and turbulent even than Lady Macbeth. It was withdrawn shortly before the premiere. Instead, he set about writing his 5th symphony, which had its premiere in 1937 and was described as his response to criticism. It had an enormous success with audiences around the world. His 7th symphony, the Leningrad, became such a potent symbol of Soviet resistance to the German invasion that on one occasion it was used in live warfare. On the occasion of the Leningrad premiere, during the 900-day siege, the music was broadcast over loudspeakers into no man's land with the object of demoralizing German soldiers on the other side. In the succeeding decades, Shostakovich became an ever more celebrated Soviet artist who wielded considerable power in the musical realm, even after a second wave of repression in 1948. But he never escaped the pall of fear that came over him in 1936. He became the preeminent haunted soul of 20th century music, the master of the art of fear. Julian Barnes's recent novel, The Noise of Time, an evocation of Shostakovich's inner world in the period I've described, shows how representative he remains. He speaks for the modern condition of feeling never secure, never pure, always compromised, always acquiescing. Hitler's musical taste has been much studied over the years, and the details are familiar to most. He was infatuated with Richard Wagner's operas from an early age, and stated in one of his wartime monologues that a performance of Wagner's Rienzi first inspired him toward a political career. When he started making his way in conservative circles in the 1920s, his knowledge of Wagner invariably surprised and impressed upper-crust people who were predisposed to see him as a low-born rabble-rouser. His speeches of the later 20s often touched on cultural matters and showed some acquaintance with the musical scenes in Berlin, Munich, Vienna, and elsewhere. Unlike Stalin, who attempted to bring art into total congruence with Soviet ideology, Hitler wanted the arts to maintain a degree of independence, or at least the appearance thereof. When Hitler arrived at the Wagner Festival in Bayreuth in the summer of 1933, after taking power, he requested that audiences refrain from making patriotic manifestations on the grounds that there is no more glorious expression of the German spirit than the immortal works of the master. Hitler actually seemed to believe, after the manner of Schopenhauer, that music floated above the rest of life. This was the import of his most ambitious statement on cultural policy, his culture speech at the Nuremberg Party rally of 1938, in which he stated that, quote, "It is totally impossible to express a scientific worldview in musical terms," unquote, and nonsense to try to express party business. Hitler was not impressed by second-rate musical propaganda, as Stalin often was. In 1935, he directed that no more works be dedicated to him, and in 1938, complained to Goebbels that a group of commissioned pieces paled in comparison with Bruckner. Hitler's taste in contemporary music was extremely limited, but not always predictable. It is usually assumed that when the leading progressives of the Weimar Republic fled Nazi Germany, those who remained were politically conservative and stylistically old-fashioned, and thus suited to Hitler's unadventurous taste. That picture is accurate enough in outline, but the particulars are surprisingly fuzzy. Not all those who remained were conservative in orientation, nor all those who left radical. The great Hungarian modernist Bela Bartok received a surprising number of performances in Nazi Germany. Works following the 12-tone technique of Arnold Schoenberg were performed. And there is the lamentable case of Anton Webern, who carried Schoenberg's system to an extreme of esoteric refinement. Earlier in his career, Webern had been more left than right in his politics, but in the 30s he was overcome by a wave of German nationalist feeling. And in his wartime diaries, he expressed dismaying displays of enthusiasm for Hitler. A pupil recalls him saying that, quote, "One should attempt to convince the Hitler regime of the rightness of the 12-tone system," unquote. All the same, he found it increasingly difficult to obtain performances of his works. In a letter to the Reich Music Chamber, he advertised his Aryan heritage and asked for assistance. He was given a small sum, but continued to face financial distress. Just after the end of the war, he was tragically shot by an American soldier. I say all this to emphasize the point that artists in Nazi Germany were able to console themselves with illusions of limited freedom. We arrive at the question, what effect did the dictator's interest in classical music have on the art form, especially its subsequent history? After the war, the great musical philosopher Theodor Adorno and several other leading lights of modernist music proposed in one way or another that romantic style, even tonality itself, had been tainted by Hitler's touch. A similar argument was made with respect to Stalin's demand for simplicity, for music appropriate to mass taste. It was argued that serious composers could no longer entertain such populist notions if they wanted to remain true to their art. This helps to explain why so many composers took refuge in modernist techniques after the Second World War. They were, it seemed, immune from the contamination of totalitarian taste. On a deeper level, I sometimes wonder whether the entire culture of Western classical music was damaged by association. It was during and immediately after the war that popular culture began to associate classical music not with spiritual elevation, but with spiritual corruption. The 1945 Bugs Bunny cartoon, Hair Meets Hair, equated Wagner with the Nazis. Images of music-loving mass murderers proliferated in movies of the post-war years, where musicians had once been the noble, fragile heroes of prestige Hollywood pictures. After the war, they often took on a mien of sadism, of cultivated evil. Now, when a Hollywood archcriminal sets out to annihilate mankind, he often listens to a little opera to get into the mood. Hannibal Lecter, the serial killer anti-hero of Silence of the Lambs, moves his blood-stained fingers in time to the Goldberg variations. In such scenes, I propose, the shadow of Hitler and Stalin lingers. Perhaps it is even subliminally present in the famous scene in Francis Coppola's Apocalypse Now, when an aerial assault on a Vietnamese village is played out with Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries blaring from loudspeakers. And we should take note of the fact that Coppola and his screenwriter did not actually invent this episode. Wagner was reportedly used as live accompaniment to several American attacks in Vietnam. And now that the movie has entered into cultural lore, it has cropped up again in real-life combatant situations, including the most recent Iraq War. Before a raid on Ramadi in June 2003, soldiers of the 1st Battalion of the 124th Infantry Regiment psyched themselves up, according to a Reuters report, by listening to the Ride of the Valkyries. Wagner, it seems, has become an appropriate soundtrack when American soldiers set about administering death. In America, of course, we wished all along to think that we were different, that we were immune to these sorts of complications, that artists were free to express themselves, even if they had to suffer in obscurity and poverty in the process. Exiles from Hitler's regime landed safe on American soil, Mann, Schoenberg, and Stravinsky among them. Roosevelt, who served as president from 1933 to 1945, the same span of years as Hitler's term as chancellor and dictator, had a quite different relationship to music, more casual, not at all fanatical, rather indifferent for the most part. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, set forth a shining example of a great power manipulating music to enlightened ends. When the daughters of the American Revolution refused to let the great African-American contralto Marian Anderson sing at their concert hall, Mrs. Roosevelt publicly resigned from the organization and gave support for a concert by Anderson on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Yet that isolated triumph of political forces embracing music as a tool of liberation masks a wider and deeper failure, one that brought a pernicious new strand of cultural warfare into American politics. In 1935, Roosevelt unveiled, as part of the Works Progress Administration, a sprawling federal arts project in which he proposed to give employment to thousands of artists, musicians, and writers who had lost work during the Great Depression. The Federal Music Project created hundreds of orchestras, opera houses, and new music series across the country. There was talk of instituting a permanent arts agency. But then, in 1938, conservative Democrats formed an alliance with resurgent Republicans to curtail the New Deal, and they found the arts programs with their tendencies toward radical ideas a juicy target. The House Un-American Activities Committee, chaired by Martin Dees, launched an investigation of the WPA, in the course of which Congressman J. Parnell Thomas charged that the Federal Theater Project was one more link in the vast and unparalleled New Deal propaganda machine. Thomas and Dees were contemptible figures, and yet they were not entirely wrong. The WPA had, in some instances, produced a kind of propaganda. For example, the living newspaper play AAA Plowed Under criticized the Supreme Court for striking down the centralizing bureaucracy of the Agricultural Adjustment Association. It was a brief on behalf of Roosevelt, who in those years was at war with the Supreme Court. The House Un-American Activities Committee was, of course, heard from again. In the post-war era, it went on the prowl for communists in various sectors of government, the arts, and the entertainment business. The committee's counterpart in the Senate was Joseph McCarthy's permanent subcommittee on investigations, which in 1953 called the composer Aaron Copland as a witness. Copland was one of many American artists who had moved to the left in the 30s, seeking a simplified language through which they might engage with the masses. His Fanfare for the Common Man derived its title from a speech that Vice President Henry Wallace, the most radical member of Roosevelt's administration, delivered in 1942 to the Congress of American Soviet Friendship. Copland came under scrutiny at the height of the anti-communist hysteria. His Lincoln portrait was removed from the program of Dwight D. Eisenhower's inaugural ceremonies in 1953, and the subpoena from McCarthy arrived 4 months later. Fortunately, Senator McCarthy had little idea who Copland was and did not summon him back for another interrogation, but the composer experienced difficulties with his passport for some years thereafter. At one extraordinarily charged moment of the Cold War, Copeland's path crossed with that of Shostakovich. This was at the Cultural and Scientific Conference for World Peace, which was held at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York in March 1949. Shostakovich was asked personally by Stalin to attend. He read speeches that were prepared for him. He answered questions in accordance with instructions whispered in his ear. On the final night of the conference, he performed the scherzo of his Fifth Symphony at Madison Square Garden before an audience of 18,000 people. Left-leaning American artists of all disciplines and persuasions gathered at the Waldorf to greet their Soviet counterparts. Henry Wallace was there, Clifford Odets, Lillian Hellman, and Arthur Miller also attended. Thomas Mann sent a message of support. Copeland greeted Shostakovich at the airport and sat at the head table. Assembled on the other side of the political barricades was a coalition of disenchanted leftists who called themselves the Americans for Intellectual Freedom. This group was receiving clandestine support from the Central Intelligence Agency. One of its most prominent members was the composer Nicholas Nabokov, who had been associated with Diaghilev's Ballet Russe and was a close friend of Stravinsky, and who later became a cultural functionary during the American occupation of Germany. At the Waldorf, Shostakovich and Copeland appeared together at a fine arts panel. Shostakovich's contribution was a 5,000-word speech that ranged from music to international politics to domestic policy. It would be too much to say that the composer delivered it. He sat in silence while his interpreter read it aloud. The composer in the speech was allegedly attacking Stravinsky for betraying his native land and joining the ranks of the modernists. And it went on to denounce, quote, new aspirants for world domination now engaged in resurrecting the theory and practice of fascism, unquote. That is, the Americans. Copeland responded with temperate, thoughtful remarks in which he disavowed any political agenda. The heart of the speech was an affecting elegy for the lost idealism of Roosevelt's New Deal. Lately, I've been thinking that the Cold War is almost worse for art than the real thing, for it permeates the atmosphere with fear and anxiety. An artist can function at his best only in a vital and healthy environment for the simple reason that the very act of creation is an affirmative gesture. An artist fighting in a war for a cause he holds just has something affirmative he can believe in. The artist, if he can stay alive, can create art. But throw him into a mood of suspicion, ill will, and dread that typifies the Cold War attitude, and he'll create nothing. Nicholas Nabokov was in the audience, and he kept his gaze fixed on Shostakovich. He later recalled, throughout the tumultuous conference, I watched Shostakovich's hands twist the cardboard tips of his cigarettes, his face twitch, and his whole posture express intense unease. He seemed like a trapped man whose only wish was to be left alone to the peace of his own art. The knowledge that Shostakovich lacked freedom of speech did not prevent Nabokov from forcing him to speak. He rose from his seat to ask whether Shostakovich really endorsed the condemnation of Stravinsky and Schoenberg. Shostakovich had no choice but to say, I fully agree with the statements made in Pravda. Decades later, Arthur Miller was haunted by the memory of Shostakovich's moment of humiliation. God knows what he was thinking in that room, what splits ran across his spirit. Several days later, Life magazine opened fire on the entire world of the New Deal, the Popular Front, and the U.S. Communist Party. A sardonic photo essay identified 50 dupes and fellow travelers who were said to be aiding the communist cause. Copeland was featured along the likes of Thomas Mann, Albert Einstein, Dorothy Parker, Langston Hughes, and Charlie Chaplin. A strange rogues gallery, Mann called it. He feared that America was falling victim to the same totalitarian madness that had consumed his German homeland. And he began to think about emigrating once again. 3 years later, he moved to Switzerland, where he died in 1955. The author of The Magic Mountain and Dr. Faustus had come to America looking for freedom from demonic politics, and he did not find it. In the year 2017, all this history may seem in one way very distant. Composers in the Western classical tradition no longer occupy the central roles that they once did. The art of classical music is in most countries far more marginal than it once was. But this does not mean that the general question of music's relationship with power has receded. Now it is other genres who must face the dilemmas confronted by the likes of Strauss and Shostakovich. Above all, it is a question for popular music, which in the late 20th century enjoyed the reputation of being a liberating force, free of links to state power, outside the sphere of the elite. But for some time now, pop music has been allied with the might of enormous media corporations. The billionaire titans of Silicon Valley, who exert vast powers over our daily lives and have created an unprecedented structure of global surveillance, are not often seen at classical music concerts. They put on t-shirts and jeans and occupy the $1,000 VIP seats at stadium shows by Bruce Springsteen and Beyonce. No matter what the political persuasions of those artists, their songs blare at rallies by politicians of both the left and the right. Springsteen's Born in the USA notoriously served as a theme song for Ronald Reagan, and it is painful to say this out loud, President Donald J. Trump, a businessman turned reality TV star who is as much a pop culture phenomenon as a political one, has shown a fondness for the Rolling Stones. 3 of their songs appeared on his inauguration playlist. The history of classical music in the 20th century may be a prologue to the cultural politics of coming years. Amid the general retreat of liberal democratic ideals in the early 21st century, the country that has, for many people, become a beacon of hope is Germany, the site of the greatest crimes against humanity in world history. Tellingly, Germany has maintained faith in its cultural traditions despite the deep scars they bear from the Nazi period. State funding remains strong for orchestras and opera houses. The operas of Wagner are produced widely, though they are couched in often an avant-garde theatrical aesthetic far removed from that of the Nazi period. It is understood that there is a great deal still to be learned from that tradition, from Wagner not least. What is the central message of The Ring of the Nibelung, from which The Ride of the Valkyries derives? It is a tale of the destructiveness of the desire for power, of the incompatibility of love and power. I'm now at work on a book called Wagnerism, and I have no worries about its relevance in coming years, whatever they may bring. And I just want to say in closing how grateful I am to the Jaipur Literature Festival, those who invited me here, for giving me, at the most saddening and frightening moment in the recent history of my country, an atmosphere of exuberance, of multiplicity, of polyphonic affirmation. And I hope to take some of that spirit back home with me. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. I mean, he rewrote entirely all last night what he was planning to do because he was so upset by what has just happened. But basically, you're talking about the history, the 20th century history of freedom of expression as it affects musicians, as it affects composers in particular, though players and critics have their role as well. A critic can be terrorized into silence just as well as a musician. So I was, this freedom from demonic politics, which Thomas Mann was talking about. Demonic politics seem to be upon us on every continent practically now. And one of the most interesting things for us, perhaps talking about music, is music does have both a moral and an emotional force. And tyrants have always harnessed it, and composers want to break free from it. Can you imagine a scenario now in your country in which a Shostakovich wants to put on something like Lady Macbeth of Beklemsk and is forced out?
Well, first of all, we simply don't know what's going to happen. And obviously, the advent of a real dictatorship is, fortunately, by no means certain at this point. But some of the early signs have been very ominous, and certainly those, I think, who thought that Trump would pivot toward a more reasonable point of view and sober up and become aware of the gravitas, the gravity of the office. I think those people have so far been disappointed. But the fact is, no one in politics cares about classical music anymore in America, really almost universally. It is very much on the margins. So the idea that a composer like Shostakovich in a putative authoritarian regime in America would undergo that experience is it's simply impossible. But one can picture someone from the pop music world being placed in such a position. And we have to keep in mind that there already is a kind of dictatorship, which is the dictatorship of the marketplace, which exerts such power in the American cultural field, not only in the making of music and the making of art, but also in the writing about it. And in my field, in newspapers and magazines, I've watched everyone become more and more concerned, obsessed with counting the hits and measuring precisely the impact of any given piece and the sort of immediate ramifications of those statistics. And this kind of echo chamber, this instant measurement of the precise reach of one's writing, I think is very debilitating and necessarily changes what you do and forces ever more work geared toward the lowest common denominator to the forefront and sort of casts everything else to the side. So that's already been a very disturbing development. And we see how the mechanisms of the internet, of social media have been brilliantly manipulated by Trump and his various hench people. So it's already an ominous situation, even without contemplating what's coming next.
Okay, well, so let me play devil's advocate. It's sometimes said that art flourishes under really bad politics. Some of the worst. Under Stalin, I'm a poet, we had 4 fantastic poets who were really, really important to the whole Russian people during the Stalin years. Some of the sort of almost lethal city-states of the Renaissance produced the most wonderful art. So how about that you have really bad politics and some fantastic music?
I don't really agree with that. Yes, there was some extraordinary music and literature that came out of the Soviet Union. There was very little extraordinary music and literature that came out of Nazi Germany. So it's by no means guaranteed that a restriction of freedom of expression, that a repression of the artist will bring about somehow more powerful expression. And on the other hand, if you look at America in the 60s and 70s, during this great heyday of a liberated society, really one of the more liberal periods in the history of America, we find a great exuberant expression all across the cultural field, and I'm particularly fascinated by the American minimalists, the minimalist composers of the 60s and 70s, and they benefited from from an extraordinary and unprecedented openness, including openness to non-Western traditions. And that was very important in their development. So I think ultimately it depends on the nature of the artists themselves. If you have artists of enormous force and strength of character, no matter what the political situation, they will produce great work. And I think if Shostakovich had somehow ended up in New Jersey and had written a string of symphonies in New Jersey, we would now be admiring them and contemplating how they confront the difficulty of living in New Jersey rather than the Soviet Union.
Yes. Well, let's go a little bit into the music and lay the politics aside for a moment. The picture that you give in The Rest is Noise is a sort of picture of exciting fracture, really, when influences come in from jazz, from popular music, from other places, but then also fracture from within the 12-tone system. Would you like to say a little bit about how tradition is broken and then something new is made? You give a wonderful picture of Boulez as so savage on anybody who was playing Stravinsky's music, he turned his back on people. Whereas poor old Shostakovich, sitting in Russia, revered Stravinsky's music, but had to listen to his own, supposedly his own words, repudiating him there.
Yeah, well, this is very much part of the narrative of the book. I mean, it's sort of several narratives interwoven. At the heart of it, I think, are these stories about the collision of composers with politics in the mid-20th century. But, really, it's also a story of an extraordinary series of breakthroughs and revolutions and debates, a kind of all-out artistic warfare, divisions and reconciliations, and unlikely influences and collaborations across those divides. And I find all that tremendously exciting. And one great purpose I had with this book was to try to bring some light to a field which is mysterious for many people. Western classical music is already become a somewhat marginal art form, as I mentioned, in America. And the people who are devoted to Western classical music tend to have a great deal of difficulty with everything that happened after 1900. They are devoted to, they grew up with music of the 18th and 19th centuries, and I did myself. That was all I listened to as a child and into my teenage years, and I ignored everything else. And then I started to discover the 20th century. I had a wonderful piano teacher who introduced me to Bartók, to Schoenberg and Berg, and these sounds were absolutely weird and even repulsive because they just rejected everything that I found familiar in terms of harmony and melody. But at the same time, there was a fascination. I wanted to figure out why, what's going on here, and I became pulled in and went on this great voyage of discovery through my university years, decade by decade, going through the 20th century into the successive waves of the avant-garde. And then I actually finally discovered popular music, which I'd totally ignored until then. Because once you get into the 50s and 60s, the wild sounds of the avant-garde of that period can sound a great deal like free jazz or like the noisier, more experimental end of rock music. And I had friends who loved that music who said, you're listening to Xenakis or whatever it was, this sounds like Cecil Taylor, you should listen to Cecil Taylor, or the band Sonic Youth, and that's how I made the leap into popular music. So with this book, I wanted to recreate that journey for others. Perhaps many people have told me they tend to come from the other direction. They've grown up with popular music, and then they discover Steve Reich and the Minimalists and something else, and then they can sort of go backward in time. So I wanted to sort of bring all that drama to life and show where it was coming from, why these composers did what they did, and enacted these seemingly shocking revolutions in musical language.
Yeah. Yes. Before we throw it open to ask to you, I was thinking just as you were talking that there was a strange moment in Britain in the 60s, 70s that both the popular tradition, the Beatles, and the classical tradition, the wonderful violinist Yehudi Menuhin, both of them came to India to learn Indian music and be open to Ravi Shankar, for example, supremely, but other people as well. And so I suppose that one thing which you may say, and which I'm sure Alex will go into if you want, is how the 20th century, with all its wars and its breakages of tradition, is also the century of technological exploration, so that we get electronic music and the possibility of sharing between influences.
Yeah, and Indian classical music exerted great influence on 20th century music of the Western tradition at various points. And early in the 20th century, composers like Henry Cowell and Lou Harrison were listening to it, and also to Indonesian gamelan music and Chinese and Japanese music, which was more accessible to them because they were living on the West Coast, where immigrant communities sort of made that music available to them. And then John Cage, of course, was influenced by Indian philosophy, especially the writings of Coomaraswamy, and also by Zen Buddhism. And then in the 60s and 70s, as I mentioned, the minimalists, Lamont Young, very closely studied with Pandit Pran Nath, and Philip Glass with Ravi Shankar. And Glass's whole minimalist method owes a great deal to Indian classical tradition. So it's been a very important influence all along. And yes, this openness through technology that you can simply get a recording. You don't need to have a sitarist performing in your immediate neighborhood. You can experience it on recording. That has opened up the world of music in extraordinary ways.
So we have sort of 10 minutes for questions. When you get the microphone, please wait till you get the microphone. There's a question here, and then one there.
Hey, thank you for all that. I was wondering, what are some of the reasons that you think that classical music has sort of receded from popular culture, political culture? Yeah, I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, it's a good question. It's something that I obviously struggle with every day as I write about classical music. I'm in the very fortunate position of writing for a magazine, The New Yorker, whose editor, David Remnick, was here at Jaipur a few years ago, which lets me write at great length about this music and does not worry whether an enormous fraction of the readership cares about it. And many of my colleagues have not had the same fortune and are writing less or writing not at all. And so I'm very grateful for that. But of course, I think about it all the time. Something I try to do in my own work is to open up this world of classical music to more people, to do what I can to bring people in. But in my talk, I mentioned this idea that the legacy of Nazi Germany did damage to the reputation of classical music because of the spectacle of many great classical musicians and composers becoming caught up in the Nazi cultural machinery, and this spectacle of Wagner and other classical composers being used as incidental music to propaganda rituals. But there are many other forces at work. Popular culture, popular music, has in many ways substituted for classical music. It has become ever more sophisticated. It was sophisticated all along, and it has become art music, serious music, for so many people they delve into the discographies of their favorite artists. They study the work closely. It's not simply sort of superficial background music, and it's very difficult to say. And you should be listening to these 50 living classical composers as well as the entire tradition. There's a sense of competition, and I think classical music has not always done well to update itself, to sort of open itself to contemporary life. I mean, so many of its rituals seem very outdated. I'm impressed by the fact that here, the Hindustani classical music seems more integrated into the wider culture, and I'm sure many of the devotees of that music will say, no, but it's such a struggle, and we face so many difficulties. But nonetheless, I think if you declare yourself, if you say I love this music, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, you'll get exactly the kind of reaction that you get in America if you say you love classical music there, and people say, oh. It's seen as snobby, elite, kind of geeky, sort of socially backward, a kind of strange agglomeration of social categories that don't always kind of make sense together. But I certainly felt it growing up. I was something of a social outcast for loving this music when I was a kid, and that's an enormous problem.
Yes, it could be a whole topic for conversation itself. There was a lady there, and then you, and then you.
Yeah, thank you for your reading just now. Alongside, what you said about suppression, I was also thinking about how resistance may have come through as well in music and in other art forms. Well, in the 60s, 70s, we've had Bob Dylan as a figure of, resistance. But now, when we had him win the Nobel Prize, there's something which has gone quiet for most people. And I was thinking back parallelly to another story which has nothing to do with music, but actually Maya Plisitskaya, who was this famous ballerina, and she was performing during the time of Stalin. And there's an interview with her where she says that Stalin was supposed to come and perform, and witness one of her performances of Swan Lake. And there was such a huge security around that every time the ballerinas were running in and out of stage, they had to produce their identity cards. There was somebody checking on them. And she says, because your talk had this thing about silence, the rest is silence. And she says, that was one day I did not hear the music, and they just performed like marionettes. And 2 days later, she realized it was their best performance because Stalin was dead.
Thank you. That's wonderful. There's a question here down in the front, please. With a stripy job.
Just stand. Hi. So there is a strong evidence to suggest that Richard Wagner was an anti-Semite, and it is a fact that till this day the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra does not play his works. So the question is this: if the artist has strong political leanings, how far should that weigh upon his oeuvre or artistic work? So the artistic work should be judged by its own merit, or should the political affiliations or leanings of the artist have a bearing on it?
I think, could you say, the question is, should the artist take account of the political...
If the artist is, let's say, aligned to a certain political ideology, then when judging his or her works, should that have an influence on judging the artistic work? Like, let's say, the output of Wagner. Should
the feeling influence the composition? Yeah.
So the fact of should Wagner's anti-Semitic writings and other ideologically malignant utterances, should we take that into account listening to his music. Whew, well, that's what I'm writing a book about right now. Wagner, you know, for anyone who says, I can't listen to this music, it gives me some horrible feeling, you know, especially someone who lived through the Holocaust or had relatives who lived through the Holocaust who spoke of, you know, hearing Wagner when they were young. You know, I respect that utterly. I don't argue with that. I wouldn't say, no, you have to listen to Wagner. It's you know, there is an incredible problem there, which is really unlike that of any other composer, any other case of music becoming enmeshed in politics. And yet, I do find as I read more and more about Wagner, you know, his politics were very contradictory and complex. And you know, there was also a revolutionary, quasi-socialistic side to Wagner. There was a side to Wagner that was inclined towards pacifism, that did not believe in the power of the state. And so to view him as, you know, directly as a prophet of the fascist state, this sort of all-powerful totalitarian state, I think is really to misunderstand his politics thoroughly, despite the virulence of his anti-Semitism. So it's a complicated question. I respect those who refuse to listen to Wagner, but I think you know, he can be appropriated to very different political ends successfully.
It's a huge question. You'll have to read his next book. We have half a minute. If you have a very... Oh, no? Oh, we don't even have half a minute. I beg your pardon. Censorship and comes down upon us. He will be signing his book. Please go and buy his book. It's really interesting. The section that he's talking about is really in the middle, but all of it is wonderful. And he's one of the best voices on music today anywhere in the world. So please applaud him one more time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We thank Alex and Ruth for the wonderful session we had with them. And we thank our sponsors, Amity University.